Whether you're with me live or watching this recorded, I'm honored to spend this time with you. This is season 2, episode 2 of the Backyard Naturalist series, where we look at the extraordinary stories in our ordinary backyard wildlife. And today's episode is called MONARCHNADO. Today, we will look at butterflies in general, with the monarch butterfly as the main character. But first, I want to say a word about our sponsor, so to speak, UEC in My Backyard, a website that is chock full of great activities, videos, how-tos, and stories for people of all ages. There's a new story with Tori, a new 5 facts with Danny about the Carolina grasshopper. What are the 5 facts? I'm not going to spoil it. You should watch the video. You'll thank me later. And you can join educator Alex Labonte as she explains how to can tomatoes. So check out this site early and often. I'll also give you a very quick report on last week's Backyard Birding Blitz. Collectively, we had 21 checklists submitted from 4 states, more than 1,000 birds, representing 57 species, some nice team names, including the Northern Alula, the Celtid Blingfishers, and the No-Re-Egrets. And some of the highlighted species, a ruby-throated hummingbird from Minnesota, a Philadelphia vireo from Wisconsin, a black-billed magpie from Colorado, and my favorite, a hooded warbler from Central Park in New York. So thank you, Ethan, for compiling all this in the report. Look for another version of this in the spring, and this is a great reminder to tell your friends inside or outside of Milwaukee or Wisconsin that they can join these events. And in the meantime, anyone outside Wisconsin can also join us for our monthly Yardversity events, which was recently featured in a public radio piece by Susan Bentz. No matter where you are in the world, you can contribute to this database of backyard plants and animals, which just this week surpassed the 1,000th observation mark. Thanks, everyone. And I just checked, we are still at 499 species. So we are one away from 500. So if you go out this morning during or after this lecture and add a new species, you could be the one to get us to 500 species. And as Ethan mentioned, the next Yardversity event will take place in October, on October 24th, Saturday morning. And of course, there will be events in the days leading up to the actual Blitz. And the theme next month is salmon. You probably don't have salmon in your backyard, but near your backyard, and fish in general, and the salmon migration in the area. Okay, the monarch butterfly. It's elegant, it's beautiful, graceful, and perhaps one of the most iconic insects in the world. But like any good glamorous Hollywood star, it too has its dark moments. And today we'll look at many of the secrets behind several species of butterflies, including the monarch. Some are magical, some are comical, and some are downright gross. Adult butterflies have 6 legs and wings, which is one of the characteristics that help us know they're insects. To learn more on what makes an animal an insect, you can rewatch season 1, episode 10, A Spittlebug's Life. Butterflies are in the order Lepidoptera, along with moths, and Lepidoptera means scaly wing. Their wings are indeed covered with scales, which offer protection and give butterflies their coloration, as Ms. Minger pointed out. Let's get right to it. You probably heard that if you touch a butterfly wing, you will render the insect flightless and therefore likely kill it. And that is as false a statement as the one where if you touch a baby bird, the mother will smell human and abandon it. Also not true. Butterfly wings are fairly delicate, but they're also pretty tough. Remember, they need to withstand a migration of sometimes over 3,000 miles, so they need to be pretty tough. For many species, you can even tell how old a butterfly is by how beat up its wings get, because eventually, like a good pair of shoes, the wings do deteriorate. And most butterflies in the adult form only live a few weeks. So I don't recommend going around and touching butterfly wings, but with training, a person can learn how to hold butterflies that minimizes the probability of harm. And obviously, if you hold it and you're so rough with it that you tear it or puncture a hole in it, you should probably reconsider what you're doing. Or the other possibility is that you could harm it if you had a lot of oil on your skin from lotion or sunscreen, or even worse, if you had chemicals from bug spray like DEET. But gently touching a butterfly wing with clean, dry hands, or with training, holding a butterfly by the wings is not going to do as much harm as you've probably heard. But one thing that will definitely not cause harm is looking at a butterfly wing under a microscope, where you can see the scales that give them the name Lepidoptera, or scaly wing. And the closer you get, the closer you look with an electron micrograph, the more intricate and beautiful they seem. So this is from a swallowtail butterfly wing. Here's a section of scales from the familiar red admiral butterfly that we see around here. And here is an electron micrograph of the orange section, or N orange section, of monarch butterfly scales. And this series of pictures, I just think is way too cool. So you're zooming in closer and closer on butterfly scales, starting from the biggest view on the upper left and the most narrow view on the lower right. And as you zoom in and get closer, you can really see the microtexture that's even on a single scale of a butterfly wing. If we go back to the views we're more familiar with, we can say that Lepidoptera, the order, includes butterflies, like this peacock butterfly on the left, and moths. If you talk to some entomologists, they'll say butterflies, moths, and skippers, but recent phylogenetic evidence has grouped skippers back with the butterflies, and now many refer to them as skipper butterflies. We're not going to say too much about moths right now because they absolutely deserve their own episode. But just like in the last episode, where we learned that wasps are the major grouping that spawned the bees and the ants, the moths are the major grouping that spawned the butterflies. So a butterfly could really be considered a distinct type of moth. But however you look at it, butterflies are in their own superfamily called the Papilionoideae. I think papillon is butterfly in French. And that separates them from the other moths. There are actually many more species of moths than butterflies, but one of the reasons that we're so much more familiar with the butterflies is that they're mostly diurnal, meaning they're out in the day, and moths are mostly nocturnal, and we are mostly diurnal, particularly when we're looking at nature, and it's a little harder to see things at night. Which is kind of the first major distinction to that important question: what are the differences between moths and butterflies? And like any good biological grouping, we're talking mainly about generalities here. So there's almost always exceptions. And I'm just going to cover my bases and use the word most a lot. So we've already said that most butterflies are diurnal and most moths are nocturnal. And as we go through these differences, I'll keep the butterflies on the left and the moths on the right. But even this one difference in flying it in the day or at night has a huge effect on their adaptations. Because butterflies are diurnal, they rely much more on their sense of vision, and as a result tend to be much more colorful than their moth counterparts. So as a general rule, butterflies are more colorful than moths. Of course, there's always exceptions. Another difference between the two has to do with how they hold their wings. Allie Ward, the wonderful host of the Ologies podcast, which is where I find a lot of the great info for several of these episodes, she likened butterflies to sailboats because they generally hold their wings straight up at rest. And she likened moths to stealth fighters because of the way they hold their wings flat and back at rest. So again, there are exceptions, but this is a general rule. Another major difference between butterflies and moths has to do with their antennae. Butterfly antennae tend to have a kind of a club at the end, while moth antennae are either completely straight or usually very feathery. And the most likely reason for this is, again, that butterflies rely much more on vision for finding food or mates or avoiding predators, while moths need to rely more on other senses like smell and chemical communication through pheromones. So that feathery antenna is like a really souped up version of rabbit ears that some of you remember. And it allows them to really sense chemicals in the air, which is really what you're doing when you're smelling, particularly pheromones. An adult male silk moth can detect a single pheromone molecule in the air after being released by a female 2 miles away, and then he'll triangulate to get to her. And it's the antenna that are kind of playing that warmer, colder game you play with your kids, like, you know, looking for something. You're warmer, warmer, colder, warmer, warmer. And they use that kind of back and forth triangulation until the pheromones concentration becomes stronger. And that then leads them right to the female, and sometimes vice versa. The final major difference between butterflies and moths is that the pupal stage of butterflies is usually called a chrysalis, which really is this kind of thin wrapping that protects the pupa as it makes that final transformation into an adult. That wrapping can be somewhat transparent, and if you were to poke it, you might get a reaction from the metamorphosizing individual inside. And there is a professor named Aaron Pomerantz who developed a way of cutting a window into the chrysalis to see the pupal stages of the butterfly as they're developing. It's like a transparent window with probably some kind of plastic to see that transforming pupa, which, as I mentioned, I think in the last Yardversity, it reminds me of the cow at the state fair that had that plexiglass window cut into its stomach, which really disturbed me, but allowed you to kind of see the process of the digestion in cows. Pupal moths, on the other hand, usually form a cocoon, which involves a thicker, silky wrapping on the outside of kind of that thin chrysalis-like membrane. So functionally, it's like they have both, or just a much more established outer layer, and they have that extra protection on the outside. And that's usually because moths are often in the pupal stage for much longer and in harsher conditions, like over the winter. So they might have to survive several months of cold and snow in the cocoon, which is much more protective, whereas butterflies are usually only in that pupal form for just a couple of weeks. And here it's summer or spring, but usually kind of right in with summer. So to kind of sum up, butterflies are mostly diurnal, mostly more colorful, holding their wings straight up at rest with that clubbed antennae forming a chrysalis, whereas moths are mostly nocturnal, usually less colorful, holding their wings flat and back with usually the feathered antenna and forming a cocoon. There are about 180,000 species of Lepidoptera in the world, which makes up 10% of all described species of living organisms. So 1 out of 10 of everything is in this group, almost as impressive as the beetles. To get a sense of how few butterflies there are relative to moths, there are about 800 species of butterflies in North America and about 12,000 species of moths. What turned out to be a much harder question to answer is, where did the name butterfly come from? There is no clear answer, but Allie Ward broke it down into a few fun possibilities. So first of all, some species of butterfly poop or frass. I don't know if frass is a verb as well as a noun, but they frass yellow, or the frass has a yellow color. And in Dutch, the word for butterfly is buttervlieg, which translates to buttercrapper or butterpooper. The German word for butterfly is Butterfliege, which translates to thief of dairy protein or milk liquor or butter liquor. Another translation is rooted in beater fly, by the way it rapidly beats its wings, like a fly beating its big wings. But my all-time favorite butterfly origin story, and the one that I'm going to stick with, has to do with a type of yellow sulfur butterfly found in England that literally looks like it is a pat of butter that is flying, hence the name butterfly. And that's the most popular etymological story for where the word butterfly came from. So that's a pat of butter flying by. It's a butterfly.
Hey Tim, we have a question from a few slides earlier. Someone is asking, are the antenna measuring vibration, smell, or sound?
Mm, that's a really good question. I think the answer is a lot of everything. And so one thing I didn't really get into here is just the way that butterflies sense the world. I talk about that a lot in previous episodes, but um, they they hear with basically pieces of hair that are all throughout their body. They smell and they sense pheromones very differently. Their nervous system is quite different. So I think the safest answer coming from a non-lepidopterist specialist is probably a little bit of everything. I think for the most part, those antennae uh, are for getting pheromones out of the air, since pheromones and smell is a really important part of their conversation, or part of their, I should say, their daily life, part of their communication. And so I would say that that's primarily what it is, but we could all look into that together. But I feel like a lot of these pieces of their body function in a multitude of ways. So excellent question, and one that we can all look into together. So I'm not going to dwell too much on the life cycle of a butterfly. There's a lot of insects that go through a very similar life cycle, complete metamorphosis. We saw this in the wasps and the spittlebugs and some of these other insects. So, but I think we're all fairly familiar, particularly in the butterfly. And when I'm describing those other insects, I'm usually referring to the butterfly because I think that's what we're most familiar with. So a female butterfly will lay an egg. And in the case of monarch butterfly, that's usually on the underside of a milkweed species. So here is a monarch egg, that kind of oval shape with the characteristic ridges. If you ever do monarch monitoring with Maggie, this will be the thing that you're looking for underneath the leaves of plants as we look for eggs, and then you're also looking for the larvae. From this egg, an adorable first instar caterpillar will hatch and immediately start to eat the eggshell from which it hatched. So the egg contains important nutrients, and since we learned that caterpillars are really eating machines, they can't afford to waste any nutrients. That's what caterpillars do, is they eat. After it eats the eggs, it doesn't stop. It's an eating machine with the goal of fattening up and growing as quickly as possible. So the children's book, The Very Hungry Caterpillar, which maybe someday will make it to Story with Tori, is a pretty accurate description because caterpillars are eating machines. Pretty soon, the first instar caterpillar becomes a second instar caterpillar, slightly bigger. It sheds its old skin, kind of like unzipping and taking off a jacket that's too small for you, except that we don't usually eat our jackets, whereas the second instar larvae will eat the exoskeleton that it just shed from the first instar. And then the second instar sheds its skin and eats it, becoming a third instar, and then a fourth instar, and then a fifth and final instar. So they just keep growing. And when you're doing the monarch monitoring, you're looking for all of these stages, and there's ways to determine which stages are which. The other thing that the monarch caterpillar is doing is eating milkweed leaves, and only milkweed leaves. And we'll talk a little bit about how important it is to plant native species for butterflies in your backyard. But milkweed, in addition to being so great for butterflies, is by far my favorite group of native plants. And the flowers of the common milkweed, if you see common milkweed everywhere and you haven't given it a big old sniff, making sure there's not a wasp on it, it's just one of the most beautiful smells. And then the red milkweed, or the swamp milkweed, maybe my favorite smell in anywhere, because it just has this, it's not as in your face beautiful as the common milkweed is, but with the swamp milkweed or the red milkweed, it's just such a subtle just teaser of a beautiful scent, and I really love that. So we'll talk about it a little bit later, but yeah, planting milkweeds and other natives is really, really important. But the other thing about milkweeds in general is that they have a type of poison called glycosides, and after the caterpillar ingests that poison becomes incorporated into its body and remains there as the caterpillar metamorphoses into an adult butterfly. So it ingests that poison to incorporate into its body so that it itself becomes poisonous for the rest of its life, and that's a defense against the many organisms that would love to eat it. After completing the 5th instar, the caterpillar creates the chrysalis around itself, and as it moves into that pupal stage, and there is evidence that during this magical transformation from a caterpillar to an adult, and I don't know how scientists know this, but it actually retains memories in the form of aversions and I don't know what else there would be. There's also evidence that the 5th instar, that biggest caterpillar, which looks straight up like a caterpillar, already has some of the adult parts of the butterfly growing inside it. And in the pupal stage, there are things called imaginal discs that you kind of picture kind of floating around that eventually oversee that metamorphosis as the rest of the body is kind of turning into mush. So one of these imaginal discs, for example, will develop into the eyes and the visual system. Another one will develop into the wings and so on. And another really cool thing to remember, think about, is that this entire process from egg to adult with all these changes is coded in the genes that it has at birth. So some genes are only expressed in the larval form and then turned off in the adult form, and vice versa. And some are only expressed in the pupal form for this great transformation. And then eventually, through what I just said, plus wizardry and magic, an adult butterfly emerges. And at this point, its priorities are changing quite a bit. Caterpillars, again, are eating nonstop, but that's not the case for adult butterflies, at least for the most part. During migration, they do have to eat quite a bit. But in some species, adults don't even have mouth parts. And so the average adult butterfly, again, lives about 2 weeks. And its goal at this point is to make more butterflies. And interestingly, some lepidopters claim to be able to tell the difference between adult male and adult female butterflies by the way they fly. So adult males, they say, fly like they're in a hurry and they're not messing around, and they need to find females and find a mate, and they're not messing around. Whereas adult females, they say, tend to fly with a little bit more of a casual, relaxed attitude. So haven't witnessed this for myself, but it's something to look for. Males are searching sometimes desperately for females, so they don't have to be, the females don't have to be too stressed about finding a mate, and eventually they'll just need to find some nice place to lay their eggs. Now, this, of course, isn't the case with all species. But in this slide, the male monarch is on the right, identified by the 2 darker spots on the hind wings. And in some butterflies, specialized scales like that are for producing pheromones to attract females. That's likely the case for monarchs. It's what I've learned, but we're not completely sure that that's the case. So you'd think we know everything about the most studied butterfly in the world, but there's still a lot we don't know, and we don't know 100% what those darker spots are for. But butterfly mating isn't all that ordinary, and maybe as bucolic as one might expect. So I mentioned that we'd start to have some stories with mystery and intrigue, and show some of the blemishes, and we'll start to introduce some of those here. So in some butterfly species, the males will use a hook-like structure at the end of their genitalia to first scoop out any sperm that might have been previously deposited in that female before depositing his own sperm, just to make sure that those eggs are fertilized by his gametes and not someone else's. And that's just kind of the tip of the genitalial iceberg, so to speak, because seriously, stories of insect genitalia are no joke. The butterfly stories are relatively tame in comparison. When you look at some of the other insect genitalia, it's crazy, crazy, crazy stories. But continuing here, in some species, the male butterfly will also leave their sperm and then kind of put a plug in the female after mating, like a cork on a wine bottle, so that another male can't give their sperm to that female. And for one of the craziest butterfly mating stories, and I'll send you a link, here is the title from an article in the Atlantic. And I'll send you the link. You can read it for yourself if you want to, but maybe just knowing that this article exists is enough for you. But you know, there are some really crazy butterfly mating stories out there. But none of them are all this kind of protective, overtly protective. There is kind of more there's a more maybe gentle or sophisticated view of butterfly mating. And this comes in the form of nuptial gifts. And there are two main types of nuptial gifts, essentially, that the male gives to the female. So first, you'll have the gift of rare or important nutrients that are important for the female survival or important for the egg laying process. So hosting a developing embryo and laying eggs is energetically costly for females. And because males don't lay eggs, they will, in a sense, wrap up their sperm in this package that's called the spermatophore. You could think of it like a dowry or a gift basket with sperm. And so the sperm will be wrapped in nutrients like sodium that the male gathered from shopping at the butterfly equivalent of the florist or the jeweler. Only in this case, the butterflies are shopping in the mud or from pee or poop or from animal carcasses where they find these important and limited nutrients to give to the female during mating. The other type of nuptial gift is naturally in the form of poison, and not the kind of poison that will hurt the female, but the kind that she will integrate into her flesh that will protect her from predators. Because if there's one thing that happens to many insects, including butterflies, is that they go through life being the target of many hungry predators. And in past lectures, we've talked about aposematic coloring, which is the pattern where venomous or poisonous animals are brightly colored, which advertise their danger to potential predators. So those predators don't try to take a bite out of them, which would be a lose-lose situation, which is likely why monarchs who become poisonous when they ingest milkweed have that bright orange and black pattern. In the case of the glasswing butterfly, when the adults emerge from the chrysalis, they have lost some or all of that protective poison that they had as an egg or larvae. So in this species, it's the male adult butterfly that will visit particular species of plants. Actually, I think in this group of species, and those plants are poisonous themselves and usually rare, like species of nightshade. They'll ingest the poison, which makes them poisonous to their predators. And then when they mate with the females, in that spermatophore package, he will give her about half of his poison so that she can become poisonous to predators. So the poison is in his nuptial gift, and then she passes the poison on to the eggs that she lays. So that's win-win-win, unless you're the butterfly predator. And in this particular case, this poison is effective against insect predators in general, who are able to detect the presence of that poison through smell or other means. So all adults are vulnerable until they incorporate the poison into their bodies. And for more on that story, I would listen to the Ologies podcast on lepidopterology. Some of the other kind of dark and dirty stories can be best illustrated through looking at how entomologists, and in this case, we call them lepidopterists, how they study butterflies. And if you think about it, you know, we asked you what you most associate butterflies with, and we heard metamorphosis, we heard caterpillars, we heard beauty, and I can't read my own writing, but I think people in general will associate butterflies also with flowers. And that produces all these beautiful images for artwork or greeting cards or computer backgrounds. But this really only tells one side of the story, and you are just as likely, if not more likely, to find butterflies on less of these hallmarky card things like you'd see them on carcasses and scat, where they find these needed and scarce nutrients, like we discussed earlier, partly for themselves or for these nuptial gifts. So this may not look as good on a Hallmark card, but this is an image that is just as kind of associated with butterflies and where they're getting their food. A quick aside, I'm spending most of this talk on adults Lepidopteran, and when I do my moth talk later, I think I'm going to talk a lot more about the larval stages, because caterpillar stories are just as, if not more, crazy than the adult stories. For example, while we're on the subject of poo, swallowtail butterfly larvae have evolved to look, many of them have evolved to look like bird poo. So bird poo with tiny eyes and antenna. And on the bottom left, you can see a larvae next to actual bird poo, and you can see how effective that camouflage is. And on the bottom right, in this species, it's only the first 3 instars of that swallowtail that look like bird poo. And then when the 4th instar, before they move into the chrysalis, it looks completely different. So this group is often called the bird poop caterpillars in whatever language is spoken in whatever country you're in. And speaking of urine, that's another rare resource that butterflies seek out. And it's not just the urine of other species. So Phil Torres, who's the host of the Jungle Diaries YouTube series, free series you can look at, I encourage you, they're really good. He recounts a story on Allie's podcast where a butterfly landed on his finger to drink the salt from his sweat. And this is called puddling behavior. And it usually happens on mud, carcasses, or rotting or fermenting plant matter, or urine. But in the case of Phil, it was puddling on his finger and licking the sweat to get the sodium. But some of that sweat had already dried up to be this crystallized form of salt. And the butterfly can't really get that salt through the proboscis. So he watched this butterfly on his finger turn around to pee on the finger to dissolve the salts. Then it turned around again to drink up the fluid that it just peed. And then it repeated that behavior over and over, alternating between peeing and drinking. And speaking of behavior that you probably would only think of doing while drunk, I'm killing it with these transitions. Butterflies, like some birds, often do get drunk while puddling on fermented fruits and fly how you'd expect a butterfly to fly. So if you're looking for a fun rainy weekend rabbit holes, you can Google drunk butterfly videos. But I was talking about butterfly researches, and the most effective way to catch butterflies is with a trap like the one shown here. It's easy for butterflies to find their way in, but hard for them to find their way out since they mostly want to fly up. And then, of course, this is only half the battle. So you need to find something that will attract the butterflies. And I think if you told my 7-year-old son, Henry, or my more than 7-year-old friend, Tori, who's joining us today, to come up with the most disgusting things they could think of to put in this trap, they would likely be successful, because the grosser and smellier the bait, the more butterflies you'll catch, particularly rare butterflies that are looking for rare resources. So again, according to Phil Torres, the best things for catching butterflies in order from less to more effective are: first, a cocktail of ripe fruit, sugar, and beer. We saw a lot of this with our moth parties recently. Put those in a plastic bag, let them ferment for a while, and the smellier it gets, the better. Second, a can of rotten fish. And again, the more putrid smelling, the better. Or if you're in Sweden, you just call this breakfast. But if you really want to make this more butterfly effective, you'd add a teaspoon of your own urine to it. And then finally, the best bait is, of course, poop. And apparently, the more carnivorous the animal, the more effective the poop. So if you can find jaguar poop, you have hit the jackpot. And this might be the only thing to get some of the rarest birds to come down from the canopy to within studying distance. But as much as I want to leave you with these images in your brain and in your eyes, we're going to quickly transition to another method of catching butterflies, and that is with a butterfly net. And some of my favorite times working with Maggie is when I'm running around looking like a fool, chasing butterflies and dragonflies. But if you want to channel your inner 5-year-old, this is a great way to do it. And I've always felt that the reason that I almost always catch a butterfly was because my net was just a couple inches too short. But no matter what size net Maggie gives me, I'm still just barely missing these butterflies. So since I'm obviously not the only person who wants longer and longer butterfly nets, I'm going to play the first few minutes of this episode of Jungle Diaries. It's a 10-minute video. We're not just going to watch the first few minutes, but I'll send you the link too. If you're watching the recorded version of this, sometimes we can't post embedded video links on YouTube, so for copyright. So if this or any other video shows up as blocked, you can just email me for the link later if you wish. But here we go, and this is dedicated to you, Maggie.
Hey, I'm Phil Torres here with Dr. Susan Finkbeiner. And Susan, what do you study?
Study tropical butterflies.
And what is in your hand right now?
I have one of the world's largest butterfly nets.
One of the longest butterfly nets in the world.
In the world.
Okay, I'm not gonna lie, Susan. I'm a little bit jealous of your coolest butterfly net ever.
I have good news for you, Phil. We've got one for you too.
What? Let's go catch some butterflies.
Yeah, I'll show you how it works.
Studying butterflies for a living is not exactly what you think. Sure, there may be times when you're skipping through a field or working away in a lab, but other times it looks like this. Rivers, rocks, waterfalls, jungle. As an entomologist, Dr. Finkbeiner studies hard-to-find butterflies which sometimes live way up in the canopy, and to reach them, you're gonna need a bigger net. This type of research is critical to understanding the complexities of the tropics, and it's not without its challenges. So now, let's put these nets to work.
Each of these bowls actually represents a 5-foot extension. So you start at the top.
So how many feet are we talking? Which
25 feet plus
25.
a couple extra with the net. You're looking at close to 30 feet.
Yeah. Oh, there's a butterfly right there. Okay, let's get this thing up.
There's the extension. Tighten it back up.
Am I doing this right?
Here you go.
I feel like this is amateur hour.
Now you got one more after that one.
Like, my arms are really tired. Nobody said catching butterflies was an easy job.
It is not. You got to be in good shape.
This is my last one here, right?
All right.
I feel so powerful.
Look at that. Wow. You notice it weighs a lot once you start to tilt. Some people need an anchor to keep the net on the grounded somewhere, and then you can kind of maneuver it quite easily this way.
Wow.
Yep.
That's awesome.
But if the butterfly's a little too high, you gotta lift it up, and you have to be skillful.
Get that butterfly. Oh, I almost just fell over. So I'm already having like way too much fun, and we haven't even caught any butterflies. So I think it's time to catch some butterflies.
I think we need to create a video game that involves 30-foot long butterfly nets. So I think somewhere in my advertising for this, I posted there might be stories about intergenerational migration, turtle tears, and brains in the butt. And because I don't want to be accused of false advertising, I'll finish with these stories. But what this really tells me is that these were the stories I thought I'd be telling you today, because they represent what I knew about monarchs before doing all of this research and reading and listening. And what usually happens is I find all of this new, cooler stuff. And in the interest of keeping these to about 45 minutes or so, I find every week that there's so much more to say. So I could probably put together a sequel for every single episode because there's so much cool stuff out there. But here are those kind of last few topics in somewhat more rapid fire. So let's see. First of all, the migration pattern of monarchs was mentioned earlier as amazing and maybe one of the most mysterious and interesting adaptations out there in the world. It's intergenerational migration. So the monarchs that we see today here in September in our backyards are part of the super generation of monarchs that live for months and months, way longer than most butterflies. and all of the butterflies east of the Rockies are traveling up to thousands of miles to a small patch of high volcanic mountains in Mexico where they overwinter. And then come next spring, they start the return trip back north, but they don't make it back here. They only fly part of the way back, maybe to southern Texas. And when they're there, they mate, they lay eggs and then die. And then without any parental guidance, those eggs pick up the journey where their parents left off and continue northward. And how they know how to do that, but they might not even make it all the way back here. Let's say they make it to southern Illinois, and then they also mate, lay eggs, and die. And then it's their kids or the grand larvae of the super generation that might make it back to Wisconsin, or maybe even great grand larvae for points further north. But once they reach their destination, they still will likely cycle through a few generations of adults during the summer. So the monarchs you see in the summer are, you know, kind of that standard butterfly, couple weeks long, living, you know, like you expect from most butterflies. But then the next super generation is born here in late August, and that will then, it'll be those butterflies that will then undertake this huge migration again, start it all over. So it's such a mystery. And as I mentioned earlier, there are sources out there that do a way better job of explaining this. There's a lot of resources out there than I can do here, but I encourage you to read a book called 4 Wings and a Prayer by Sue Halpern for a really fun look into this behavior. I'll email you the link to that book on the Boswell Books website. And butterflies don't have something similar to the mammalian brain, but they do have a lump of ganglia in their heads that controls their head functions, like the eyes and the antenna and that proboscis. But this network also extends into the thorax, where it controls the wings, and into the abdomen to control the abdominal functions, including those in the butt. So yes, you could argue that butterflies have brains in their butts. And sometimes I feel that that might not be such a bad adaptation. And finally, I mentioned crocodile and turtle tears. And it is true that butterflies will puddle near the eyes and snouts of reptiles for precious salts, just as they do on humans. And to me, that's, I think, where the Hallmark card industry should be. So we have a few minutes. I'm going to end with another very brief video from the Jungle Diaries, because I just think it's a good way to kind of wrap up this episode. And hopefully you'll leave here inspired to learn a little bit more about butterflies and butterfly conservation. And I'm often asked what's the best way to help the birds, and conveniently, I give the same answer for birds as I do for butterflies. Plant native plants in your yard as much as you're willing and able to do. You know, a lot of those plants, the non-native plants, you may see a butterfly drinking from it, but the rest of that plant is pretty sterile. And so the more we can do to support the insects upon which our birds and other animals rely on is for the better. And you know, conservation is often faulted Mexico for not doing enough to save monarch butterflies, but the real problem came with the destruction of the habitat mainly in the U.S. for agriculture and development, because the spots that these butterflies need to use along the way to refuel their journey are so important. So by planting milkweed for the larvae or native plants for the adults that need the nectar, it's super important. And I encourage you to visit the Xerces, I don't know if I'm saying that right, Society website, because they've kind of done all that work for you, and they can recommend the best native plants that you can plant based on your zip code to help your local insects. And the Xerces Society is named after the first butterfly to go extinct in modern times. So we'll end with a video, and feel free to stick around to chat afterwards. And I thank you for joining us today and for supporting the Urban Ecology Center.
Okay, so I've driven for about 4 hours today from Mexico City to the top of this hill where now I'm on a horse, and we are about to see something I've wanted to see since I was about 5 years old. So at the end of every summer, millions, tens of millions of monarch butterflies take a journey south. Now, whether they're coming from Colorado, Connecticut, or even Canada, they all end up in this same forest here in the middle of Mexico. And I think it's gonna absolutely blow my mind. It's gonna blow the horse's mind, and I hope it blows your mind too. So let's keep riding.
After riding a little longer and then hiking with my local guide Jose Luis, they started to appear.
hundreds of them in the sky, and then thousands on the side of the trail warming up in the sun. And trust me when I tell you, this is just the beginning.
Not sure if you listen carefully, you can hear it, but that's not wind. That is the sound of millions of butterflies flying around me right now. And it's probably my favorite sound ever. Oh my gosh. Okay, so insane.
Meet one of nature's greatest treasures, the overwintering site of the monarch butterfly migration. To understand the migration, you have to realize that many of these butterflies are the great-great-grandparents to next year's migrants. Their journey took an average of 1,800 miles to get down here and spend the winter. This spring, it will take 3 generations of butterflies into the summer to travel back up throughout North America. Each of these butterflies has its own unique story of how it ended up here.
So we can't go any further on this trail, and there's about a million reasons why. If you look up ahead, and I gotta get this, because on the hand of my lovely camera woman, what just happened? Hi, babe.
Hi. Look,
It wants to be famous.
wants to give me a kiss.
I gave a butterfly kiss.
So they actually closed the trail up ahead, because if you look, the entire trail is covered in butterflies getting sun for the day, and it's amazing. Everywhere I look, it just gets better here.
These butterflies are the survivors. It is getting harder and harder for them to complete this journey, and their population is dropping because of it. Their native prairies in the US have started to disappear. But if you want to help these butterflies in their migration, you can. The best thing to do is simple. Plant native flowers for them to fuel up on, and native milkweeds for them to lay eggs on, and they will come.
So none of this would be possible without the help of the locals. And I'm not just talking about me being here right now, I'm talking about this entire forest being protected. Monarch butterflies have basically become a source of income and a important pride that this town has. And Jose Luis has been an amazing guide. Jose Luis, ¿por cuántos años has sido guía?
Por 16 años.
¿Y qué quieres decir al mundo de esas mariposas que solo vienen aquí?
Pues cuidarlas, más que nada, y cuidar mucho esto que tenemos aquí, del santuario del ejido El Rosario.
Ok, gracias.